It's been abundantly clear for some time that the invasion of Ukraine has been a deeply expensive one for Russia. But determining exactly how expensive is a bit of a more complicated exercise. Estimating equipment losses is comparatively easy when you can count equipment wrecks, monitor depleting storage yards, and probably make some inferences when some Russian units begin to receive donkeys to support their logistics. Yes, we are at that phase now, but it's not just Russian tanks and munitions that have been expended in Russian operations, it's also Russians. Through the war so far, the evidence suggests the Russians have mostly been able to keep up with these losses, sustaining the offensive initiative across much of the front, while also bringing enough new people into the military, not just to replace those lost, but also to expand the size of the force, which obviously raises a few questions that I want to look at today. Just how many troops is Russia likely to have lost since February 2022? How has it gone about replacing those losses? How sustainable is a recruitment approach based on paying larger and larger recruitment bonuses to older and older recruits? And what is that likely to mean for the capabilities and sustainability of the Russian military as we push further into 2025? To do that, I'll start with a brief discussion of the methods we might use to generate these estimates, as well as a couple of caveats that go with them, and then we'll start jumping into the how and who. How is Russia recruiting? How has that changed over the course of the war so far? And what those approaches have been doing to the demographics and makeup of the Russian force. Then we'll get on to everyone's favourite bit, the charts and the data, estimating Russian recruitment inflows from various sources, voluntary and otherwise. And then on the flip side, estimated outflows, generating a range of figures using Russian and foreign data. And then finally, we'll zoom out for a bit of a big picture view of what those estimates might imply about the Russian war effort in 2025 and beyond. One note up front, just as with equipment losses, I did ultimately decide to split Russia and Ukraine across 2 different videos. So while we won't be talking much about Ukrainian losses or force generation today, that video will be coming in the future. And so now, before we jump into it, quick word from a sponsor. So let me welcome back long-term sponsors of the channel, Private Internet Access. I think we can all agree that overall, the internet's got a lot going for it. It enables news, communication, education, gaming, and enables some members of the public to turn monitoring sensitive military installations into a part-time hobby. That said, the internet and broader digital landscape can sometimes have some rough edges when it comes to things like fragmentation or privacy. And so just like an armoured vehicle on the battlefield might want to layer an active protection system, armour and camouflage to minimise the chance of the crew having a particularly bad afternoon, you too might want to layer different tools and practices together. Watching things like who you give your data, where you browse, what software you use, how strong your passwords are. And then, if you're like me, you might also want to use a VPN. What they can enable you to do with a click is reroute your internet traffic, change your publicly perceived IP address, and potentially influence how your data might be logged. Private Internet Access, for example, have long stated they have a no-logs policy that has been independently audited and court-tested. And in a world where fragmentation across state and national borders might be an increasing concern, they advertise not just compatibility with a range of streaming services, but also servers across 91 countries and all 50 current US states. Oh, and they also advertise the ability of a single subscription to cover an unlimited number of devices. So if you're interested in using the VPN that I do, there will be a link in the description. That'll give you access to a stated 83% discount on a 2-year subscription, plus 4 bonus months, with the coverage of a 30-day money-back guarantee. And so with my thanks to Private Internet Access, let's get back to it. Okay, so let's open with some notes about how I'm going to try and do this. Because most of the time I don't try and focus on the human casualties component in my analysis, because it's just so hard to evidence. And frankly, I'm not sure even the Russian Defense Ministry would be entirely confident of exactly how many troops they've lost so far. So instead, what I'm going to try and do is generate an estimated range for the various things we're looking at by compounding together multiple estimates and data points. Think things like Russian and Western estimates on recruitment and losses, tracking programs like the one run by Mediazona, who look at things like the obituaries of Russian military servicemen or excess probate cases in order to generate KIA estimates. And then finally, we can look at budgets and the battlefield. Elements like how much does Russia claim to be paying in signing bonuses to new military recruits, or what kinds of Russian personnel are we seeing on the front lines. Even bringing all those together, this is very much going to be more of an illustrative than exact exercise, but I'm hoping it gets us close enough when we start to break down each of these questions. With the first one simply being, how has Russia gone about sourcing the troops it needs to fight this kind of attritional war? We know that fighting a war trench by trench or tree line by tree line, like you're reading from the 1917 playbook, is going to be expensive. The fact that Russia has continued to have the personnel necessary to fight in that way means they must be coming from somewhere. So then, where is the Russian military getting all those people? And I think the best answer there is that the business model, if you like, really depends on what phase of the war you're talking about. In the first half of 2022, there's really 2 primary manpower sources if you're describing the pro-Russian forces fighting in Ukraine itself. You have the professional active duty Russian military, so career officers, long-serving NCOs, and personnel who would generally be on their first, although possibly second, usually 3-year contract. And also initially there were a fair number of Rosvardia units involved as well. Their inclusion is perhaps a testament to the type of campaign Russian commanders expected to be fighting, and their frontline roles appear to have fallen off relatively quickly once it became clear that riot units don't tend to do particularly well when the rioters have access to tanks and artillery. While the initial Russian invasion plan was arguably a bit of an over-optimistic fuss-to-cluck, there's a lot of anecdotal feedback from Ukrainian units that these Russian professional troops, particularly those from units like the naval infantry or the paratroopers, were generally and have continued to generally be quite stubborn, capable opponents. Although their effectiveness was obviously undermined by shortfalls in planning, logistics, organisation, and the fact this was a pre-mobilisation Russian army, meaning a lot of the infantry component that was meant to be made up of conscripts had to be left at home. That left some of the invading Russian units comparatively short on infantry to protect the vehicles and other elements, and vulnerable to taking higher losses as a result. But partly making up for that shortage during this phase were Russia's proxy forces, troops from the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. A lot's been made by some commentators of the fact that after the invasion began, Ukraine moved over to general mobilisation and barred Ukrainian men of military age from leaving the country without permission. But being the clear overachievers that they are, the Russian proxies actually did that before the invasion. On February 19th, men aged 18 to 55 were barred from travelling outside the DNR or LNR, a widespread mobilisation was begun, and the cut-off age was later raised to 65. These mobilisations into so-called people's militias bulked out 2 corps, the first corps out of Donetsk and the second corps out of Luhansk. It's these formations, made up of men who, in the eyes of most of the world, are still Ukrainians, not Russians, that appear to have taken a disproportionate share of the early casualties on the Russian side, something that was arguably probably inevitable given the range of factors working against them. They were generally fighting in the Donbass, where Ukraine's fortifications were the strongest. They were commonly being used in very expensive infantry-led assault actions. There's evidence, much of it from Russian commentators at the time, that Russian commanders generally regarded these units as much more disposable than those made up of true Russian troops, in inverted commas, and despite being given some of the most difficult combat assignments, the combat power of many of these units was probably quite low. Training was sometimes about as in-depth as your average FPS tutorial mission, and whenever you see videos or images from the earlier phase of the war of pro-Russian troops toting 1940s-era equipment, like that PPSH submachine gun, a 1940s-era design, or those sniper derivatives of the Mosin Nagant, a rifle which first entered service in the 19th century for the Russian Empire, it's a good bet you were looking at images of these proxies, not Russian regulars. And the result, as you'll see when we get to the data a little bit later on, is that even according to the proxy governments in these regions, relative to the size of their population, these guys died. A lot. In late 2022, when Sergei Shoigu was claiming the Russian military had lost about 6,000 dead in Ukraine to that point, the authorities in just one of the 2 Donbass proxies were already admitting to about 5,000 dead and more than 17,000 wounded in their little force alone. Now, obviously it feels like Shoigu's number there was probably sourced from a very different reality to the one in which we're living, but hopefully the comparison serves to illustrate the picture here. But I bring this up, even though we're talking about 3 years ago at this point, because I think it serves to highlight the beginning of a pattern we're going to see flow through the rest of the Russian recruitment story, where you often have a division or segregation, official or unofficial, between those recruitment methods and units that are meant to be slightly higher in quality, and those which are considered, for lack of a better term, more disposable. As one RUSI report from 2023 put it, Russian infantry tactics shifted to a stratified division by function into line, assault, specialised and disposable troops. Quote, these are formed into task-organised groupings. Line infantry are largely used for ground holding and defensive operations. Disposable infantry are used for continuous skirmishing to either identify Ukrainian firing positions, which are then targeted by specialised infantry, or to find weak points in Ukrainian defences to be prioritised for assault. Casualties are very unevenly distributed across these functions, end quote. As another commentator slightly more glibly put it, there were the blokes who were meant to die fighting, and those who were supposed to fight by dying. Early on, what there was of that disposable component was mostly coming from those proxy forces. By 2022, though, it appears it was clear even to the senior Russian leadership that that existing model wasn't working. The Ukrainian military during this phase was very rapidly expanding. We saw the success of the Kharkiv counteroffensive. Many Russian units were already lacking for manpower due to not being able to take their conscript components, and now had taken further casualties, while even by September-October, it was clear that the Donbass proxies wouldn't be able to continue to take that same rate of casualties forever. Officially at this point, Russia said that only 6,000 of its soldiers had died in Ukraine. but they announced a mobilisation of 300,000 Russian men to replace casualties and help bulk out the force. As best we can tell, 300,000 wasn't exactly a hard limit, and data for a number of Russian regions suggests they may have significantly overshot their mobilisation targets. But however large the final contingent was, it appears that, to somewhat oversimplify, the Russians divided the call up into two components. The first component were given some fairly abbreviated point the shooting end towards the enemy style training, and then rushed forward almost immediately to reinforce units at the front. And we can be fairly confident that despite all the claims about what sort of training would be given, that did happen because of publications made by the Russians themselves. The regional government of the Chelyabinsk region first started reporting KIA amongst the mobilised in early October. And early reports also claimed that this bloke, Andrei Nikiforov, reportedly a Russian lawyer, mobilised September 25th, would die less than 2 weeks later near Lysychansk. Some other mobilised personnel appear to have been diverted into longer training programs and given a greater degree of preparation before they were committed to Ukraine as part of new or regenerated units. The other major change that took place on the Russian side in September 22, which is very important for our data analysis and estimates later, is that they basically implemented stop loss on steroids. From September onwards, all troops had their contracts with the Russian MOD involuntarily extended for the duration of the so-called special military operation. You could no longer do your time and get out, and you could no longer resign. From that point on, the only main ways to leave the Russian military would be to reach the maximum age of military service, which would later be raised, become so severely wounded that the Russian military decided that you were no longer physically capable of serving, or being killed. And based on what we've seen from the Russian military so far, this is a force that would probably classify the Black Knight from Monty Python as at least partially combat capable, so medical separations might not be as common as they would be in other forces. What we might call the next phase, but really it's running in parallel with that mobilisation exercise, is the increased involvement of private military corporations and direct recruitment from prisons. This is the era of the Wagner Group, with Evgeny Prigozhin doing tours around various Russian prisons, giving his expendable speech. An important point to highlight here is, again, you have that segregation between recruits who are meant to be expendable and recruits who are meant to be slightly less so. Prisoners who join the Wagner Group from behind bars are given very different terms to someone who volunteers to join the Russian military regularly. And within Wagner, there's a de facto and organisational divide between the unit staffed with people pulled out of the prison system and Wagner's more professional troops. We saw this, for example, around Bakhmut, where many Russian sources attest to Wagner using prisoners to reconnoitre Ukrainian positions, draw fire, and generally wear the Ukrainian troops and their ammunition stocks down in order to set the conditions for assault actions that would then be carried out by Wagner's much better equipped mercenary troops. In total, Prigozhin claims that he recruits about 50,000 convicts out of the Russian prison system, and that model of prison recruitment is later duplicated by other organisations and the Russian military itself. Through the lens of some very cold utilitarian calculus, you can understand why the Russian leadership might have been drawn to the idea of recruiting prisoners. Unlike free men who might be working productive roles in the regular economy, perhaps even in the defence factories, prisoners, at least for the term of their incarceration, would otherwise represent a net negative on the budget. They're not really producing for the state, and the state does have to pay to feed them, clothe them, and accommodate them. They could also potentially be induced by something much cheaper than a cash payment, offering them their freedom. And several commentators also noted that the Kremlin likely concluded that the general Russian public just wouldn't care as much about a bunch of prisoners being shot up by Ukrainian artillery, as opposed to, for example, more conscripts from the general population of Moscow or St. Petersburg. At the same time, it's worth noting that by choosing to tap this particular reserve of manpower, the Russians did take on a number of potential drawbacks. For one, the prevalence of serious health issues in recruits was likely quite high. I'll include some links to reports citing Russian data, indicating enormous numbers of disease cases in the Russian prison system, including tuberculosis, HIV, syphilis, as well as things like mental health and substance abuse issues, all of which aren't exactly ideal features if you're talking about potential military recruits. There's also the inherent risk involved of taking people who, in at least some cases, were behind bars because they had committed violent crimes, and then shoving those people into a high-stress environment, handing them automatic weapons, and hoping they don't do violent crime anymore. Reportedly leading to cases like this one, where a Russian who was serving a 14-year prison sentence for murder was released in 2022 to serve with Wagner, later returned home where he allegedly attacked and killed an 85-year-old woman, was convicted, sent to prison, and then released again to go fight in Ukraine on contract. Despite those potential risks and drawbacks, it does appear Russia has continued to recruit heavily from the prison system long after the failure of Wagner's road trip to Moscow. It was reported in late 2023 that according to Russia's Deputy Justice Minister, the country's prison population had dropped from around 420,000 before the war to 266,000, with prisoners being recruited into specially created Storm Z and later Storm V units. We've even seen cases of Russian media reporting on some of the country's prisons being closed because they're now short of prisoners to put in them. The article on the right there quotes a Russian official stating the following, quote, "I note one alarming trend. A one-time large reduction in the number of convicts in SVO conditions prompted someone to report up to the top about the need to close penitentiary institutions for the purpose of optimization and savings. A number of institutions will be closed this year in our region. Among the most famous are the institutions at Aryanskoye and Gromadsk." He then notes his concern because he expects that in the future the number of prisoners will go back up. Quote, "Everything will return to normal since the social structure of society has not changed." End quote. In terms of how many prisoners Russia has recruited either into PMCs like Wagner or directly into the Russian military is difficult to say. But a recent Ukrainian estimate pegged the figure at between 140 and 180,000. And there are reasons to believe at least some level of recruitment might still be ongoing. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't have seen things like the recent decree saying that new recruits from the prison system wouldn't receive the same federal signing bonuses as regular recruits. But even if you take those higher-end Ukrainian estimates, indeed, even if the Russians had managed to recruit every single man, woman and child in the prison system, it still wouldn't have been enough by itself to come anywhere close to their overall manpower requirements. Instead, the single biggest source of new troops for the Russian military fighting in Ukraine has been contract servicemen, personnel who, for various reasons, sign on for service with the Russian military, and for a lot of new recruits, among those reasons is going to be money. On signing up, new Russian military volunteers will often receive multiple payments. At the moment, that usually means 400,000 rubles from the federal government, about $4,500 US at current exchange rates, and then a usually much higher payment from the regional government so they hit their recruitment targets and don't end up on Putin's naughty list. Then, in some cases on top of that, there can be additional local or special payments as well. According to some of the people online who track these things, in January 2025, if you looked at the case of a Russian signing up in the region with the most generous relevant payments, that would score them 400,000 from the central government and 3.6 million from the regional government for a final payout of 4 million rubles, or more than 44,000 US dollars. In Nizhny Novgorod, the total payment was about 3 million rubles, and then the overwhelming majority paid somewhere between 2 and 3 million. You can probably imagine if you're talking about people coming from an area where the median salary might be $600 a month, up to 44 grand is the kind of lump sum payment that's going to encourage a lot of people to make a potentially very stupid decision. To get a similar effect relative to salaries in the United States, for example, you'd probably need to be paying about 300 grand. Oh, and in many cases, the recruiters themselves also get paid for everyone they sign up, meaning they obviously have every incentive to be completely honest about the nature and risks of military service to potential recruits, and to diligently screen those recruits for any issues that might make them a poor fit for military life. What we've seen in 2024 and 2025, though, are efforts to broaden that contractor recruitment pool as widely as possible. In 2024, Putin announced an accelerated path to Russian citizenship for foreigners who agreed to sign up for contract service in the Russian military. And well before that, we'd already seen cases of foreigners fighting and in many cases dying in service with Russian PMCs. The article on the right there talks about a Tanzanian who was killed fighting with Wagner in October 2022. And the recruitment of a number of Indians into the Russian military under mixed circumstances caused something of a diplomatic stoush between the two countries. The Indian government reports it's aware of at least 126 cases of Indians who joined the Russian military under various circumstances, and while nearly 100 have been returned to India, the number of missing or confirmed dead is in the low double digits. A general extension of this category of mostly foreign volunteers are the foreign voluntold. Here, the main contribution to talk about are troops from North Korea. This is an interesting one because the troops are technically being sent by a foreign government, but as far as we've seen, to serve in Russian uniform as part of Russian operations. So far, this doesn't appear to have been the largest manpower contribution in the scale of the overall war, but one probably suspects the North Korean troops themselves probably aren't receiving any generous signing bonuses. Other than the introduction of those North Korean troops, however, the main Russian focus in 2024 and going into 2025 doesn't appear to have been coming up with entirely new ways to recruit people so much as broadening the tent. For example, you may no longer actually have to get to prison before you're offered a chance at recruitment, and instead Russians who are merely accused of crimes are being told their case will be put on hiatus and potentially forgiven as long as they agree to sign up. The article on the right there talks about the case of 62-year-old Andrei Perlov, who actually won a gold medal in the 1992 Olympics, who's now been charged with stealing about 32,000 American dollars from a football club where he was the managing director, and whose family is saying he's now being pressured to sign a contract in Ukraine in exchange for his case being frozen. It also includes a quote from Olga Romanova, who reportedly works at the NGO Russia Behind Bars, who reportedly said, quote, "This has turned Russia's law enforcement system upside down. Police can now catch a man over the corpse of someone he just killed. They tighten the handcuffs, and then the killer says, 'Oh wait, I want to go on a special military operation.' And then they close the criminal case." End quote. There was also the reported case of Yaroslav Lipovsky, who reportedly signed a contract with the Russian military soon after turning 18 in order to avoid a potential criminal record, only to be killed in Ukraine shortly thereafter, potentially becoming one of the youngest Russian soldiers so far to be killed in the war. While we obviously don't have hard data, it's worth noting the potential perverse incentive here. If officials and recruiters are rewarded for providing new recruits for the military, and individuals accused of crimes can be pressured into signing up, plus not paid the same financial benefits as regular recruits, maybe there's a bit of an incentive there for the system to charge people who otherwise might not be. And then, as well as individuals accused of crimes, you can also add those who might have significant debts. In November, Putin signed the decree, kicking in on December 1st, that potentially means new Russian army recruits could receive up to 10 million rubles, more than $100,000 of debt forgiveness, provided they're willing to put their body on the line as collateral. Some of the reporting around this suggested the contracts only had to be for at least a year, but given that all Russian military contracts, no matter how long they are currently being extended for as long as the fighting continues, 1 year in this case realistically means for the duration. I would argue there's an element of irony with Russia pivoting its recruitment tactics to go after those with significant debts, given that in many cases you can imagine those debts were partly driven or made more difficult to escape by the macroeconomic conditions created by the war in Ukraine. Depending on where you sit in Russian society, Putin's war in Ukraine may have had vastly different impacts on your personal finances. If you took a job in a military factory, for example, where salaries have been skyrocketing, the massive inflation and the interest rates brought in to combat that inflation may not have hurt you that much. And if you risk taking a job with the military itself, you're basically talking about an automatic ticket to the Russian middle class, even if you don't end up staying a member of it for particularly long. But if you're working a job with a salary that hasn't kept up, or not working a job at all, you've now lived through 3 years of elevated inflation, and if you get desperate and have to pay for something on a credit card, be prepared to pay some loan shark level rates, as in 60% per annum high. In that environment, you can understand why individuals or families might find themselves falling into a downward debt spiral. And for some, the only way they see to escape that debt, partly caused by the war, might be to go to war. It can sometimes be hard to look at the drone footage in Ukraine, the terrible battlefield conditions, and the evidence of massive casualties, and ask why so many Russian men would put their hands up to place themselves in that position. And to that, my basic response would be that most of them aren't. The vast majority of Russian men aren't taking these offers, which is why the payments have had to continue to increase, to the point where you can be talking about financial incentives that for some Russians might feel like $1 million would for some American recruits, and still have only a select cohort thinking that deal is worth it. And we can see that if we look at the ways the makeup of the Russian force has changed over time, illustrating a steady shift of the Russian military away from the pre-war professionals that it began the invasion with, towards a force now dominated by post-invasion recruits. And in order to try and make guesses about the makeup of the living in the Russian military, we're going to count the dead. Here we're relying on the excellent and highly in-depth work by the team over at Mediazona that essentially count Russian military obituaries. In many but not all cases, that will also allow the deceased to be put into a category that we can work with. For this section, to illustrate how the Russian force is changing, I'm going to focus on 4. Pre-February 2022 professional soldiers, post-2022 contract recruits, people pulled out of the Russian prison system, and mobilised personnel, MOBICs. What we're leaving out then are some not-included or noisy categories like proxy troops, PMCs, or foreign contingents like the North Koreans. Because shockingly enough, Russian papers don't tend to carry obituaries for foreign troops that are totally not there in the first place. The core assumption we're going to make here is that there's a correlation between the troops who die in Ukraine and the troops that are sent to Ukraine. Although obviously it may not be a perfect correlation if some troops are treated as more disposable than others. But even with that caveat, it does show us a pretty stark pattern. The chart you can see on screen here is divided into half-year periods, running from the start of 2022 to the end of 2024. And what you can see is that in the first half of 2022, basically all the dead in this data set were contract soldiers, 90% of them pre-war professionals. This was a war being fought by the original Russian army, with some new recruits starting to come through. By the second half of 2022, though, Wagner started recruiting their suicide squads and mobilisation has begun to kick off. The split between contract soldiers and mobilised or prisoner soldiers falls to roughly 50-50. And then in the first half of 2023, prisoners are the single largest category, with the contract troops making up only about 30% when you're looking at just these categories. The problem with having expendable troops, however, is that eventually you expend them. And so between the first half of 2023 and the first half of 2024, the share of prisoners in our sets drops from about half to only around 10%, while contract troops go from making up less than 30% of these KIA to about 2/3. Finally, by the last period in our data, the second half of 2024, pre-war professionals who by this point have presumably in many cases been promoted, moved to specialist or rear area duties, or might actually be pre-war professionals transferred from other parts of the Russian military to the infantry or combat components of the ground forces, only make up around 15% of this KIA sample. The prisoner and mobilised share is the lowest it's been since 2022, and a majority of the dead are now post-2022 contract recruits, suggesting that relative to the casualties being suffered, the other categories just couldn't keep up. And this transition in recruitment sources since February 2022 has had a massive impact on the demography, if you like, of the Russian military, one that might have significant implications for the capability of the force going forward. In February 2022, the Russian military that invaded Ukraine was generally fairly young and healthy, at least by the standards of what we would see later. The enlisted contract troops that made up a majority of the army's strength would have mostly been in their 20s. They would have had time to go through the full pre-war training programs, and they were subject to a pre-invasion level of medical thoroughness when it came to ruling out people for medical reasons. Just like most militaries, that doesn't mean every recruit would have been in stellar health, but they were also a long bloody way from recruiting entire cohorts of grandfathers to serve as frontline infantry. If we look at some of the Russian obituaries from the early phase of the invasion, it backs that overall picture up. The median age of the dead appears to have been in the 20s, while the mean was approximately 30, pulled up by a comparatively small number of much older professional NCOs and officers. If you look at this chart here of confirmed Russian officer KIA that we have obituaries for, you can see a little of what I'm talking about. The largest spike is in the 24 to 26-year-old category. Those are your junior officers, your Russian lieutenants coming out of the Russian officer education system. Then you have this extended curve where no category between 27 and 47 has a lower number than they did for 21 to 23. And then you still have literally hundreds over the age of 50 and some over the age of 60. At that end of the spectrum, you're usually either talking about very senior officers or former officers that have been called back into service. But for me, one of the most interesting columns is actually that 21 to 23-year-old bracket, because that represents officers that are getting into the fight and getting killed relatively quickly for the Russian system. Part of this might be the Russians have decided to truncate their officer training and start graduating classes early. In 2021 and 2022, for example, the Far Eastern Higher Combined Arms Command School reportedly graduated its officers in late July. In 2023, that was accelerated by 3 months to graduation in late April. And interestingly, while you do see some older personnel in the Russian officer losses, the median age actually starts to skew later and later as you look at each successive manpower source the Russian military turned to. So far, for example, the median age of dead mobilised personnel was between 33 and 35. Albeit with some over the age of 50 and a small number in that 18 to 20-year-old bracket. The prison recruits are slightly older again, with a median bracket of between 36 and 38, but they have absolutely nothing on numerically the most important contingent: contract soldiers recruited post-February 2022. The makeup of that cohort, as you can see from the chart on screen here, is inching ever closer to some true Volkssturm shit. The median age bracket for those killed has been 42 to 44. The largest single age brackets are 48 to 50, followed by 45 to 47, and recruits in their 50s well outnumber those in their 20s, suggesting a strong majority of those who have signed up for contract service in the Russian military after February 2022 were born in the Soviet Union, at a time where technically the Ukrainians would have been their countrymen. If you chart the youngest group, Russia's officers, who in most other militaries would generally be much older than the enlisted personnel they're leading, up against the oldest cohort, the post-2022 contractors, you can see the difference on the right there is even just visually very, very stark. And that clear visual difference runs alongside some pretty blunt statistics that serve to illustrate how the Russian military has been getting older as the war's progressed. For example, according to one source, more than half identified Russian KIA in Ukraine in the first half of 2024 were aged 45 or over. According to some reports, in the Moscow region, more than half of new recruits are over the age of 45, and the average age of those recruits increased from about 40 at the start of 2024 to about 50 10 months later. The question of why we've seen this trend towards older, and yet older recruits probably needs to be considered at both an individual and a societal level. Russian recruitment figures, for example, have significant regional and socioeconomic skews. The Moscow region, for example, has a population more than 8.5 times higher than the region home to many of Russia's Buryats, but that much poorer, ethnically distinct region accounts for about 80% as many identified KIA as the much more populous Moscow, suggesting a possible correlation between the wealth and makeup of a region and how likely its residents are to become Russian military casualties. Meanwhile, both Russia and Ukraine face demographic pressures to call up older and older veterans. We've seen a lot of focus, for example, on the Russians calling back veterans of the war in Georgia or the Chechen wars to fight in Ukraine. But on both sides, we have some reported cases of troops who fought for the Soviet Union in Afghanistan in the 1980s, deciding to don a very different uniform almost 40 years later. Part of the answer might be that Russia is just a country that doesn't have that many young men. Men who should be in the young fighting age cohort now are those who should have been born in the 1990s or early 2000s. A famously abysmal time in Russian history where a lot of families would be more focused on just surviving and keeping their heads down, while the oligarchs, mafia and new political elite went about looting what was left of the old Soviet Russia, and so probably not particularly inclined to start pumping out a bunch of kids. That might explain why you see comparatively more recruits in their late 30s than in their early 20s, but it doesn't entirely explain why we see so many in their 40s or 50s. But there's probably some ice-cold strategic calculus that might push Russia and Ukraine towards favouring that older cohort. From a basic common decency perspective, every human being has value. But from an economic perspective, losing a man in his 50s is a very different proposition to losing someone in their late teen years or their early 20s. If you lose a 20-year-old, you're not just losing all the productive economic years they might have had in the regular economy, from age 20 through to their mid-60s most likely. You're also losing the economic benefit of any children they might have had, and any children their children may have had. That might be part of the reason why Ukraine, with a view to its future demography, for example, might have been trying so desperately to protect the men in that 18 to 25-year-old category. But meanwhile, if you're a member of the Russian government looking at casualties growing amongst the 50 and 60-year-old cohort, you can imagine a hyper-cynical view being that every casualty represents the loss of a soldier, but also significant pension and healthcare savings. Statistically speaking, the average life expectancy for men in Russia is only about 68 years. And so while very personal and economic factors might be driving these recruitment patterns, some very harsh demographic logic might be part of the reason why the Kremlin's willing to go along with it. But while humans are very individual creatures and different jobs in the militaries have different requirements, there is a limit here. You reach a point where you probably just can't expect a 55 or 60-year-old to carry as much weight or storm into an opposing trench line the way a younger, fitter man might. And the age limits on Russian recruitment have now gone, hopefully, about as high as they can go. For more junior personnel, the maximum age is now at 60s, and for more senior personnel, 70. To put that into perspective, that means potentially calling up men who, by Russian life expectancy standards, should already have died. And what that suggests to me is that over time, even if Russia can keep up with the pace of recruitment required, the quality of that manpower may potentially continue to degrade, especially as given, according to Russian state media, the Russian Ministry of Defense is currently in the process of adjusting its standards slightly, with the idea seemingly being to make better military use of Russians with minor medical conditions. Those minor conditions, by the way, reportedly include syphilis, hypertension, central nervous system atrophy disorders, schizophrenia, and psychotic disorders. Because obviously the correct treatment protocol for someone with schizophrenia is to hand them an RPG and put them in a high-stress combat situation. The core point here is that as we move the discussion on now towards the question of quantity, it's important not to forget the kinds of people sitting behind those numbers and what it might suggest about the quality of the Russian force going forward. Okay, so let's talk numbers. I'm going to split this into two big questions. First, inflow, how many troops is Russia managing to bring into the system? And then later on, the question of outflow, how many Russian troops is Ukraine managing to remove from it? And what I'm going to try and do here whenever a number is contentious is bring together multiple different sources, presenting Russian numbers, Western estimates, and any other evidence we might have alongside each other to try and get the broadest picture possible. Some of the baseline numbers aren't particularly difficult. Both Western and Russian sources generally agree that the Russian armed forces had about 1 million uniformed personnel in February 2022, and because we don't have hard evidence to establish otherwise, we're going to go with the Russian claim of 300,000 personnel called up as a result of the 2022 mobilisation. Although obviously not all of those 300,000 would have been called up at the same time, nor would they have reached the front at the same time. We've already gone through some estimates of the scale of prisoner recruitment based on what the Russians have said about the prison population, Ukrainian estimates on total recruitment, and of course what Prigozhin said about those that specifically went into Wagner. So the question mark we'll spend the most time on, and by far the most significant in statistical terms, is how many contractors the Russians have managed to recruit. For at least the last year, many Western estimates I've seen about Russian recruitment activity have zeroed in at around the 30,000 per month mark. The 30,000 figure would appear in Ukrainian sources in January 2024, the UK Defence Ministry would use it in March 2024, and other sources would repeat it, sometimes with a range attached, throughout the rest of the year. There's a lot more to this story, and the estimates have changed over time, but 30,000 per month provides us a useful baseline figure going forward. Then we have the Russian numbers. Senior Russian figures, including Medvedev and Putin, have given us estimates for yearly recruitment activity in 2023 and 2024, as well as our figure of 300,000 mobilised from 2022. It's likely there also was some contractor recruitment taking place in 2022, but the situation's a little bit harder to model with any certainty, because up until September, it was also possible for existing contractors to leave the system without having to become killed or seriously wounded first. So for the moment, let's stick to 2023 and 2024. In that year, Medvedev, former Russian president and current deputy chairman of its Security Council, said the country had recruited 410,000 military contractors by November. You can see reporting on that in Russian state media on the right. The defense minister at the time, Sergei Shoigu, gave a figure of 335,000 by the end of September, including 50,000 in September itself. If we extrapolate that average monthly rate out to the end of the year, it gives us a total of 446,000. Then there is an even higher 2023 figure, also cited in Russian state media, attributed to a relatively highly placed Russian source, Vladimir Putin. In broad strokes, he said the following: every day, over 1,500 people submit applications for military service. This year alone, about 490,000 contract servicemen and volunteers were enlisted. Over 4,000 Russian students have taken an academic leave of their own free will and are now fulfilling combat missions. As an aside there, I don't know how boring and difficult your academic setting needs to be for the war in Ukraine to be considered a more attractive alternative, but according to Putin, about 4,000 Russian students thought that was a fantastic trade. The reason I pulled out those extracts is not just to highlight the creative way to avoid classes that Russia is now apparently offering some of its students, but also to highlight that Putin's larger 490,000 number appears to be a little bit more inclusive than some of the others. It appears to include not just contract servicemen doing the actual fighting, but also people joining certain volunteer and support units. And given he goes on to talk about volunteers establishing facilities for manufacturing drones and camouflage nets, or students donating 17 tons of blood, it seems likely he's casting a bit of a wider net with that nearly 500,000 figure than some of the others are. But beyond just what Russian leaders say, there's also an opportunity here to follow the money. Remember, as I said earlier, new contractors joining the Russian military are meant to receive a federal signing bonus. That federal signing bonus comes from a particular non-classified, for some reason, line in the budget, and so some particularly enterprising researchers were able to estimate how many new Russian recruits received their signing bonus in 2023 by exploiting the advanced intelligence technique known as taking the total payments made and dividing them by the value of each payment. We don't yet have all the data for 2024, and if the Russians ever notice, we may never get it. But for 2023, that method gives a number of signing bonuses signed around 350,000, a number which would be fairly in line with that Western estimate of roughly 30,000 per month we discussed a moment ago, but somewhat lower than those other Russian claims. The gap ranges from about 65,000, if you use that Medvedev 410,000 figure, all the way up to almost 150,000 if you use the Putin number, although again, that's assuming that everyone he was referring to were new contract soldiers who would have been eligible for this kind of payment. I'd also caution about reading too far into this number, as it's always possible, for example, that troops were paid in 2024 despite being recruited in 2023, or that they were never paid at all. The method is also fraught with some uncertainty, but I think it provides us a useful data point. Then we have our 2024 recruitment claims. By this point, Shoigu is obviously no longer the Minister of Defense, so we don't get a sequel figure from him, but we do have new ones from Medvedev and Putin. At various points, I'll link the articles in the description, Medvedev gives us a figure of 450,000 recruits, Putin 430,000, and to give us a third data point, replacing Shoigu, reportedly a member of the State Duma Committee on War, while seemingly dismissing calls for further mobilisation, gave a figure of 760,000 contracts signed over a longer period, apparently encompassing at least 2024 and 2023. If we make that assumption around timelines and then compare the Sobolev, Putin and Medvedev numbers to that baseline Western estimate of about 30,000 per month, then you get this chart here for the years 2023 and 2024. A consistent 30,000 per month going all the way back through 2023 would yield a total of 720,000 recruits over that timescale. Remembering here that extrapolating that 30,000 figure all the way back through 2023 may not be the safest assumption to make, but I think it's useful here for illustrative purposes. Sobolev's figure is 20,000 higher, which might include recruits from 2022. Medvedev's figure is 140,000 higher, and Putin's estimate 200,000 higher, which is certainly a significant gap, but neither unexplainable nor particularly massive given the uncertainties involved here. If you start bolting some of these various claims and estimates together, you get this chart here. What it shows across various sources is the sum total of Russian contractor recruitment and mobilization. So usually 300,000 mobilized plus however many contractors that source claims. And a massive point that immediately stands out is that compared to things like equipment losses, the variance between Western sources and even the higher-end Russian claims here isn't particularly wide. At the lower end of the spectrum, you have a recent estimate by the International Institute for Strategic Studies, which estimated Russia's total mobilization and recruitment personnel inflow at about 980,000 to early 2025. There is then a very small gap between that figure and the Sobolev figure of 740,000 contractors, plus an implied 300,000 mobilized. Total 1.04 million, only about 60,000 higher. Assuming there's no double counting or mixed definitions, the Medvedev figure is then about 120,000 higher again, with the high-end Putin estimate maxing out at 1.22 million. Assuming that all else being equal, there's a tendency for the Russian estimates to trend high and the Western estimates to trend to the lower end. If I had to put money on it, I'd suggest the real figure is probably in that 980,000 to 1.16 million range, which is obviously a significant variance in terms of number of people, but for this kind of work, we should arguably be quite happy to have a spread in the 20% range. But while recruiting people is one thing, as we've seen with both Russia and Ukraine, getting them trained and formed into coherent and capable units is another. And so I think the evidence suggests that when new manpower has come into the Russian force, it hasn't always been treated equally. When the mobilization happened in 2022, for example, some of that cohort were pushed forward very rapidly as basically untrained replacements to fill out the line, as we know from how rapidly the obituaries for some of those individuals started to appear publicly, while others appear to have been held back, given much more extensive training, formed into more coherent formations, and were then committed significantly later on, presumably with more combat power. In late 2023, the Estonians published an estimate of how many troops might fit into that well-trained category, provided they don't have to be committed early to make up losses in the short term, saying that, quote, if undisrupted, Russia has the capacity to train approximately 130,000 troops every 6 months into cohered units and formations available for launching operations. Additional troops can be mobilized and pushed into Ukraine as untrained replacements. It's possible that training capacity increased overall in 2024 after that report was written, despite, it must be said, Ukrainian missile crews sometimes delivering live-fire training lessons to Russian training grounds. But I think at the big picture level, there's still evidence the Russians are taking both approaches, training some troops to a greater standard and pushing some forward quite quickly. An optimistic take there might be the Russian command sometimes believes that troops are best placed to learn certain valuable skills, like how to not be killed by artillery and drones, in a learn-by-doing fashion. And regenerating existing units, not just creating new ones, is a major part of Russia's force model so far. To paraphrase an early 2024 RUSI report, Russia will generally try and rotate units off the front once they hit around 30% casualties and become combat ineffective, and then, ideally, pull them back for regeneration. But either way, the anecdotal evidence around the massive difference in performance between different Russian units, as well as some of the obituaries, certainly seem to suggest that not all new Russian troops are getting an extensive training program before they find themselves at the front. For example, here's a pro-Russian source talking about a claimed case where someone signed a contract with the MOD on the 8th of August 2024, only to be moved into the missing presumed dead column 8 days later on the 16th. Here's another case, claimed contract signature November 6, 2024, KIA November 30, 2024. Unless the Russian military is widely issuing time turners in order to compress its training program, there's going to be a limit to how much you can practically fit into 3 weeks, let alone 1. Going forward, it's hard to predict what the overall change in Russia's training capacity is likely to be. And just like Ukraine, Russia is always going to face pressures or incentives to push recruits forward before they're fully trained and formed into effective units. But training capacity itself is probably really only one part of the decision calculus there. The other element, as the Estonia report suggests, are casualties. Because the more troops are flowing out of Russian units, one way or the other, the more pressure there's likely to be to push the inflow forward as rapidly as possible. Which brings us to, depending on the circumstances and region of the person involved, the 4 million ruble, lada or bag of onions question. As Russia has been carrying on this invasion of Ukraine, how many troops have they been losing? The easy way to start here would be to look at a range of Western estimates, and there are a range of Western estimates, but given just how controversial, contested, and difficult to evidence this topic is, I actually want to start with an illustrative exercise on Russian manpower outflows according to Russian data. Now, you might be going, hey, Perun, the Russians don't exactly give us regular updates on their casualty figures, mate. And you know what? You'd be right. The Russians give us regular updates on how many troops the Ukrainians have supposedly lost. That number is now north of 1 million, by the way, according to the ever-reliable Russian Ministry of Defense. But we haven't really got an official Russian number on their own KIA since September 2022, when Shoigu said that roughly 6,000 Russian servicemen had died. However, while the Russians don't give us a casualty number, they do give us two other numbers. One is the authorised maximum strength of the Russian military at any given time, that is, how many troops there can actually be in uniform. And secondly, they give us recruitment figures. And since September 2022, when it became practically impossible to leave the Russian military for any reason other than becoming a casualty, it's become possible to take those two public numbers and use them to estimate the secret number, as long as you've mastered advanced skills like addition or subtraction. Before the February 2022 invasion, the Russian military had an authorised uniform strength of about 1.01 million. Since the invasion, that number has been increased 3 times. By 137,000 in September 2022 to 1.15 million, by an additional 170,000 to 1.32 million in December 2023, and then in September 2024, an additional 180,000 to 1.5 million. That is meant to be the maximum authorised number. And since Russian troops can really no longer retire unless the Ukrainians or Russian-friendly fire retires them first, if the Russian force didn't have any casualties, that would suggest they would need to either mobilise or recruit about 490,000 personnel in order to reach their new maximum force target. But of course, they claim to have recruited way more than that. If we assume the only inflows Russia has had towards that 1.5 million total are the 300,000 called up in 2022, plus the number of contractors the different sources claim that Russia has brought on, this chart is what you get, with the number in blue being the number of troops that Russia needed to recruit in order to reach its targets, and the figure in orange being the number of troops recruited beyond that target, according to each source, who presumably must have gone somewhere. If we note the Sobolev or Western figure we generated earlier, that suggests an implied outflow of somewhere between 530 and 555,000. Medvedev's figure implies 673,600 disappearing Russian troops, while Putin's highest estimate calls for 733,000 disappearing Russians. And note that those implied outflows do not include troops that wouldn't have been on the Russian MOD roster at the time of their death. Think Wagner, North Koreans, or proxy troops in early 2022, for example. And that also implies that by the time these estimates were made, so late 2024 or January 2025, Russia had already managed to hit the force target that it only set in September 2024, which just seems logistically unlikely given how long it took the force to step up previously, and B, if that were true, we would have expected Russian recruitment activity to either come to a screeching halt or the force limit to be raised again, because it seems unlikely you would keep recruiting troops at the same rate and increasing signing bonuses even further if you'd already hit the maximum limit. If instead we use that 1.32 million force level that was authorised from December 2023 through to the very end of 2024, the actual on-paper Russian troop requirement drops to only about 306,000. With the implied outflow increasing to roughly 733,000 if you use the Sobolev estimate, up to as high as 913,000 if you use Putin's numbers. That interplay you're seeing between claimed recruitment levels and force levels is similar to why I get so confused when I see pro-Russian sources, for example, claiming that Russia is firing enormous numbers of artillery shells. We can see what Russia is achieving on the battlefield, so if you claim they're firing 10 shells for every one the Ukrainians fire back, the question becomes, why are they achieving comparatively so little despite that enormous expenditure of materiel? Similarly, if you claim 100,000 patriotic Russians a month are signing up to storm the gates of NATO, the question becomes, given the limits the Russians themselves have set, where are they? Now, yes, it's possible there may be some statistical noise here that could move the numbers a little bit in either direction. There may potentially be some double counting in the data. For example, if someone was mobilised in September 2022 and then later signed a contract. And it's also possible the Russian military at the time it invaded may have been somewhat under strength. But there are obviously limits to how much factors like that are likely to explain here. In short then, if you take Russian claims around recruitment and force levels on their face, you end up implying a casualty or outflow rate of anywhere between 550 and 913,000. Then, on top of that implied casualty range to the regular Russian force, we have to start adding some extra components. Think the proxies, the PMCs, and any relevant foreign components. Whether these are going to already be baked into the headline figure really depends on which estimate you're looking at. So keep that in mind when you're trying to figure out whether or not to bolt these on to any given Western or Russian estimate. Only one of the two Russian proxies, Donetsk, was ever publicly releasing casualty data, and that stopped in December 2022, at which point they admitted to over 21,000 killed and wounded. Since that time, though, analysts have continued to monitor obituaries in these regions the same way they have in Russia proper, and by September 2024, they estimated between 21,000 and 23,500 killed, not casualties. To illustrate then, if you took a 3-to-1 ratio of wounded to dead, that would imply roughly 80,000 casualties. To put that in perspective, given one of Russia's stated reasons for the invasion was the protection of the people of the Donbass, more than 20,000 military KIA would suggest that just the DNR and LNR's military dead figure is about 840 times higher than the number of civilians that were killed by hostile activity across the entire Donbass, including the Ukrainian-controlled sections, in either 2021 or 2020. Even if you just use the 4,163 dead figure, which is just for the DNR, and according to their own authorities, you're still talking about more losses than the total civilians you would expect to die in more than a century and a half if civilian casualties in the Donbass had continued at their pre-invasion levels. If that's what being saved by Russia does to an area's demographics, I can imagine many places being keen to deter any future Russian assistance. Then we have the PMCs, by far the largest being Wagner, which is thankfully also the one we have the best numbers for. Long before his both figurative and literal descent from power and life, Prigozhin gave us estimates for the number of troops that his PMC had lost, giving a figure of 22,000 killed and 40,000 wounded. Thankfully, that aligns pretty cleanly with some of the other estimates out there. The UK rounds slightly, giving a number of 20,000 killed and 40,000 wounded for 60,000 in total, and the upper end of the obituary-derived number is also in that range. So with that in mind, we can probably tentatively chalk up another 60,000 casualties roughly, before a majority of Wagner's fighters were required to contract into the regular Russian military. Finally, we have the North Korean forces, and here we really have no Russian data to go on. But because it's a relatively small part of our overall picture, I'm comfortable just going with the South Korean estimate on this one, roughly 3,000 casualties through to this January, which finally brings us to some headline estimates by Western or pro-Ukrainian sources. For Russian military casualties, the IISS, in a January report, estimated at least 172,000 Russian troops killed and 611,000 wounded, for a floor estimate of 783,000 casualties. The UK MOD sets the bottom of their estimate at least 790,000 killed and wounded, while claims by the Ukrainian MOD are significantly but not absurdly higher, 856,000 killed and wounded at time of recording. Estimates from Mediazona and the BBC are a tad more involved. They have a total estimate of between 159,500 and 223,500 killed in action, of which very roughly 100,000 have confirmed and identified obituaries. And to me, one of the most striking things here is just how similar some of these numbers are to the figures we generated using things like Russian recruitment claims, force levels, and signing bonuses earlier. All those numbers could still be wrong, of course, but it is a much tighter spread than we see with equipment losses. Yes, if you wanted to cherry pick, there are much higher and much lower claims out there. President Trump was recently reported as saying, quote, "We have numbers that almost 1 million Russian soldiers have been killed," end quote, but as well as the potential for exaggeration or simply rounding up. I wouldn't be surprised if this was a case of someone referring to troops being killed when they meant troops becoming casualties. Remember back in 2022, von der Leyen referred to 100,000 Ukrainian troops having been killed since the war began, and a number of pro-Russian sources immediately jumping on that as evidence the EU was admitting, in inverted commas, a much higher level of Ukrainian casualties than was previously believed. Instead, as we said at the time, her office quickly clarified that she had meant to say 100,000 casualties, so dead and wounded, not just dead, and so I suspect the recent statement on Russian casualties may have included a similar kind of error. As anyone who's ever written a briefing, speaking notes, or a speech for a more senior leader probably knows, there's never a guarantee they come out that way. In summary then, there's no real limit to the number of methods we could use or estimates we could generate. And really, in the end, it's up to you and the audience to decide what cohorts of losses you'd like to include or exclude, and which source statements you trust more than others. But if you're just going off the numbers we generated today, I think it's fair to say that anything beginning with a 6 when it comes to Russian casualties is very much at the lower end. The Ukrainian figure of more than 860 going on 900,000 is at the top of the range, And depending on what they claim to include, a lot of the middling estimates tend to begin with a 7. Although given the age of many of those estimates, you'd expect that some of them may soon, or indeed may already, have ticked over to begin with an 8. But I think expecting to zero in too confidently on a single number or a very tight range is probably unrealistic given the nature of this exercise. What we can be fairly confident of, I think, is that Russian casualties have been extensive and are expected to continue being extensive. Putin, as we said, signed off on increasing the size of Russian forces by 180,000 towards the end of 2024, and so of course Medvedev is saying the country needs to recruit another 450,000 contractors in 2025, which, considering he claims they recruited 450,000 in 2024, despite only signing off on a 170,000 increase in the forces, does potentially raise a question about his 2025 numbers. Namely, why would you have to recruit an extra 900,000 blokes over 2 years to fill an additional 350,000 seats? But almost whatever the raw number of Russian losses is, from a cold strategic perspective, the more important question is probably what does that mean for the overall war? Because history provides both examples of countries taking horrific casualties and still emerging victorious, as well as those that would end up defeated despite not losing enormous numbers of troops. It's generally assessed that Russian troop inflows from late 2022 through to early 2024 were more than sufficient to cover their losses. More recently, however, the analytical picture has become a little more murky. The chart you can see on screen there, for example, is from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and their estimate is that recent Russian recruitment efforts may no longer have been enough to keep up with loss rates, and the number of Russian troops deployed in Ukraine may actually have peaked in early 2024. Others suggest the number of deployed Russian troops may have continued to increase, but often raise questions about the sustainability of the model. The problem with trying to determine whether the model is sustainable enough, however, is we don't know how long the Russians are going to have to sustain it. There's currently a major public push towards war termination from the White House, but still, publicly at least, a significant gulf between the negotiating positions of Kyiv and Moscow, not to mention a number of other relevant, often European actors. The future of the Russian recruitment model looks very different if you think it only has to hold together a couple of months until a peace can be reached, or if you believe there's a lot of war potentially still to come. For me, the question of sustainability is probably at least partly a financial one. For a fair while now, a lot of the Russian recruitment model can arguably be boiled down to asking, are enough people accepting the money to go fight in Ukraine? And if they're not, ask if they're willing to fight for even more money. If you look at a lot of Russian military recruitment advertising now, it's not so much be all you can be or serve your country, it's hey, here's a shit ton of money to be all you can be or serve your country. The number of rubles is often one of the most prominent parts of the ad, and the payment arms race between Russian regions has started to really accelerate. If many regions were paying less than $5,000 in 2023 and all less than $10,000, by late 2024 the average was well over $20,000. And that's not counting extra incentives like growing federal payments or offers of debt forgiveness, with the latter in particular potentially being a much larger chunk of change than any of these regional payments. The question then is, how high do payments need to go in order to maintain acceptable recruiting levels? Can the regional governments afford to make those payments in order to protect the federal budget? And is there a hard limit on the number of men in the Russian population that can be incentivised to fight with higher payments? Reports that the Russian Defence Ministry might be adopting medical standards looser than a Victorian-era factory possibly suggest the desire to widen the recruitment pool as much as possible. But in at least the short to medium term, I'd argue the data probably suggests this is more a question of will in Moscow than it is of hard resource limits. If Moscow needs to find money to hike recruitment bonuses even more or bail out the regions that are now often spending a lot of their budgets on military expenditure, then there are ways they can probably find the money. It just adds even more expenses, financial, economic and human, to an already horrendously expensive war. And of course, if all else fails, additional mobilisation is certainly possible. Indeed, in the very short term, the Russian recruitment problem might actually have eased a little. Anecdotally, based on reports from just a couple of Russian recruiting locations, I've seen reports that there are actually an increased number of recruits coming forward on the belief that the war is soon going to be over. The claim is they expect that Trump will end the war relatively soon, so they can safely come forward, collect the massive sign-up bonus and the pay that goes with it, in exchange for doing perhaps a month or two of service and never actually having to fight. For the moment, we don't have any particularly good data on solid trends there, and I suspect that any Russians who made that bet after the November elections or January inauguration might already have reached the stage where they question their life choices. But if Russian media and especially Russian recruiters succeed in pushing this narrative that the war is going to be over any day now, you may have people being convinced to sign up on the belief that this is basically free, life-changing money. And if you think it's impossible that a bunch of people would think that a major event is merely days or weeks away for months or years on end, I hope you're looking forward to playing the final release of Star Citizen in your Mars colony powered by a fusion reactor. But leaving that question in the time will tell column for the moment, let's close out with some bigger picture observations. Provided we don't see any massive changes in the Russian approach and they're willing to continue hiking payments whenever necessary, I think the most likely outcome, at least in the short to medium term, is that Russia is mostly able to keep up with its quantitative requirement for new troops. That manpower may continue to get more expensive and lower quality over time, as we've seen so far, but as long as the price is right, whether that be a signing bonus, debt forgiveness, or a literal get-out-of-jail-free card, and at least in the near term, how bad the Russian recruitment challenges are likely to get, probably correlates with what Russia believes about when the war is likely to end. Because if, for example, you have an older cohort that mostly consumes state TV for their information, and as a result believes the war is going relatively well and is likely to end on positive terms pretty soon, it might be comparatively easy for recruiters to convince them there's a chance to come forward and make a pretty decent payday. Beyond that basic numerical question though, which Russia is almost always going to have potential answers to, the implication of the Russian recruitment approach and Russian casualties may have some fairly deep consequences. For example, you might have a larger and larger share of the Russian military that just aren't capable of certain military operations. You can say that older and less healthy recruits can serve in logistics and support roles rather than as frontline infantry, which is obviously true, but the casualties tend to be in the infantry units, which means that's where a lot of the replacements, who are now on average older and less healthy than they were in 2022 or 2023, are going to be needed. That might lead to a situation where you have units that are physically capable of doing basic things like holding a trench or carrying out short-distance assaults, but might really struggle if the task is more involved and demanding. Like Ukraine then, Russia might end up with a lot of units that are capable of basic assignments, but only a smaller collection of units that are capable of launching more complex operations or attempting larger operational scale breakthroughs, for example. All of this might also create something of a dilemma for the post-war Russian military, whether that's in weeks, months, or years from now. Unless you assume that Russia is going to be best buddies with Ukraine and the rest of Europe after all this is over, the Russians are probably going to want to rebuild their military. But it's kind of hard to imagine them wanting to base that military around troops that might be closer to retirement age than graduation age. That would suggest that unless the Russians are willing to massively downsize the military from current levels, they're not just going to need to maintain enough recruitment to replace people resigning once they can, resign again. They're also going to need to find a way to recruit enough younger blokes to replace all the older ones that are mustering out, which is something we might unpack a bit further if we ever get to talking about the challenges of post-war reconstruction. But those kind of questions and concerns are probably better addressed in a future video, which closes us out and brings us to the channel update. As I said, I've generally avoided casualty and force generation analysis over the last couple of years, not because it's not important, it very much is, but instead mostly because compared to equipment losses, it's very heavily propagandized and harder to prove anything definitively. In the end though, I decided that because the issue is so important and the question comes up so often, I should go ahead and take a best efforts look at both the Russian and Ukrainian figures. As you can probably tell by my voice, I'm mostly but not entirely better at this point, so hopefully things are mostly back to normal, at least as far as recording goes, in the next week or two. Next week though, we will finally have that Q&A episode that I've been promising for a while, with most of the questions coming from the patrons, and I'll put a reminder up on Patreon for any questions that might have been missed the first time I asked some months ago, but I do want to see if I can take one or two at least from the general audience, so I'll put up a community post around the time that this one goes live, where you can potentially throw up your questions and also just give a thumbs up to any that you see in the comments that you would like to see answered. I obviously won't get to anywhere near all of them, but I'd like to make my best possible effort. So please do throw your thoughts and suggestions up if you have any. Thank you very much as always to all of you for your ongoing support and engagement, and to Private Internet Access for sponsoring this episode, and I very much hope to see you all again next week.